talk today is going to be from Alice. Alice is a recent Turing graduate. She graduated from Turing School of Software Design backend in March. And before she was focusing on software, she was doing digital marketing. So that was kind of an interesting transition. We were talking a little while ago, and she said that she got a little taste of the scripting power, and she was like, I think this is what I want to do. This is what interests me. So that's pretty cool. When she's not building software, she's riding her bike around Denver, and she combined that hobby, she combined that biking with her new career, and she volunteers for the Bike Streets app, which is an open source project, which is super cool, and it's aiming to get more people biking on low stress Denver streets. So that's super cool. I've been gaining a lot of weight since I've been in quarantine. I think I should start biking, so I might actually check out Bike Streets and buy a bike and go bike on some streets. That'd be super cool. So Alice is going to talk to us about the magic and mechanics of APIs. That's the A in Jamstack, or back when it was an acronym, it was the A in Jamstack. So I'm really excited to hear Alice's talk, and I hope you all are too. So Alice Post, take over.
Thanks, Thomas. I really appreciate it. As you said, recently graduated from Turing, really focused on the back end. Let me get my screen share going. First of all, hooray, remote life. Cool. Are we good? Great. So when I was looking at the back end, learning about how to develop web applications, I was really focused on more server-side type things. And I started coming to Jamstack meetups in part to learn more about how the web is working outside of the little bubble that I was in the Turing basement. And even in that bubble, when we learned to consume APIs, I was like, this is so cool. This is it's sort of a foundation, a core part of web design for a reason. And so I've built some APIs, I've consumed APIs. And so tonight we're just gonna dig into the nitty gritty of using APIs. And so as I said, when I first learned about consuming it, it was very much just this is magic. Let me just type specifically, let me flick my wand the right way and I get all this information. It's fantastic. Now, when you understand a little bit more about it, it's more like combining different ingredients together to make a full meal, make your application do exactly what you want it to do. But it's a different kind of magic in and of itself. So as I said before, I've built some APIs. I've built quite a few Rails apps that connect to Postgres databases. And what's happening in those is these functions are making these database changes, whether you're adding resources or deleting them or updating them, and then connecting those functions to endpoints. And so when we think about making API calls, our front end part of our application connects to those endpoints, which then goes down the chain of connecting to the Rails app and then making those database changes. And then a response is given in return back to the front end. So this is sort of the main structure of your REST APIs and what's happening behind the scenes. And it's technology agnostic. The secret sauce is this type of information exchange that is going on. But it could be a React app, which I think Brian will be talking more about later on with Node. And I'll be using Vue largely because I can. So thinking a little bit more about Jamstack, the application programming interface of API. More high level, we're going to be requesting information and getting back our JSON responses and using that data, specifically digging into it to do things. And so with single page applications, you could add dynamic content, say by embedding a script or using content like iframes. And that is great. It is dynamic content, but it is functionally different than calling APIs. So let's set up our app. So you can structure dynamic information without an API. You could use JavaScript functions and source files for doing something like, say, dynamic photo display. But in our case, we're going to be using APIs for their dynamic content for using a resource that someone else has already built. And so we don't have to set that up ourselves. So let's build something. We're going to build a fairly straightforward app that a user can ask for advice. Advice is really helpful. And then a photo will appear that is relevant to that advice that we get back. And getting started, we'll just spin up our view app, create an advice component, and then update that advice template with the request that we get, with the data we get from our API request. And here's what it looks like. We have literal placeholder text, and this is getting interpolated into our information. And I have the styling of a backend graduate from Turing. We have our placeholder information coming through right here. And so in order to make that request, first we need to find an API. Like, in order to build this application, what resource are we going to find? I have before been guilty of looking at APIs and then just trying to build things around cool things that I found. But there are so many APIs out there, literally more every day. And they all do so many things, whether you want to do authentication, whether you want to like build a specific type of application based on a resource, whether it's a weather app or a book reading app or a movie or music. There are just so many out there. The Chuck Norris API does exactly what you think it does, of giving you Chuck Norris information, facts. And I've used the IBM Watson API to sort of dabble around the edges of machine learning using their services. So you can do really cool things because there are so many resources out there. But because there are so many, the question then becomes, well, there are 5 different photo APIs or 5 different music APIs. Which one do I choose? Well, the first thing you want to look at is documentation quality. Like, if you're reading the docs, can you read it and interpret it enough to actually get the information that you need? And you can test that theory with Postman. Like, if you're reading the documentation and you're able to get the data that you think you need, can you actually verify that without having to write a single line of code? And then, like, that information that you're getting back, can you actually perform the task that you need? And then overall, does it seem like that API is going to last for a while? Is it just going to disappear on you? Is it maintained and updated? What is it like to sign up and get an API key? How intensive is that? A lot of times it's just creating a user account. And then looking into rate limiting and cost after your free number of requests are done. So many APIs, there is a free number of requests, but then there are others that have 0 free requests. So you want to take a look at that before you like dive deep on a specific resource. So first, we're going to take a look at this advice slip. So this is a fun little API that is very easy to read. We have our endpoints with the URL that returns a random slip object. We can get advice by ID. We can search for it. This advice API seems to be what we want. And these are all GET requests, which is exactly what our browser is doing. So I can take a look at this and it's actually like giving me advice about washing hair. Interesting. And so like that is working in that way. So I know I can actually like call things from it. But also, as I said, like, can you test it out in Postman? And Postman is an application you can download that allows you to make those same requests with the URL in there with the specific kind of request. And you send it and it gets back something very similar. So we have another random slip of advice. And you can format it and take a look at it as JSON instead of HTML. I could test out another endpoint in this based on the documentation that I saw if I want to search particular kinds of advice, say about failing or failure. Take a look at it. We have a few more results: fail, fail again, fail better. Very developer-friendly advice. Make mistakes and try new things. And it looks like they have a couple duplicates in their database, but it's a free API, so let's go ahead and use it. So first off, before we actually like take a look at getting into the syntax, I want to talk a little bit about Axios and Fetch. So Fetch is a client-side browser feature. If you're like me and have built a service in Node, you may have had to install Node Fetch as a package. in order to make requests. I'll be using Axios mainly because the View docs recommend it, and it offers a cleaner request structure for our app. So this is set up in order to install Axios, import it and use it. And this is all from the View cookbook, and DigitalOcean has some nice community tutorials on using API calls as well. So here we have our button that we're going to add in here, and it's going to call our getAdvice method. That's function rather, that's going to use a .get to that URL that we had in our Postman call. And then we're just going to update our response, our info with the response. And when that happens, it's a lot of JSON. So let's get into using that JSON data. This is what we got. It was a lot of information, but we can dig into this. Like, we know how to traverse this with some basic dot notation, going into the data, going into the slip, and going into the advice. You'll notice also that the advice is different for each one because I was making random calls with each screenshot. So we end on winter is coming, July 1st, just about the opposite of winter. So, you know, winter is always coming. So here we have the full request that we are using our Axios function of digging into exactly what we want from there, and then using a cache in case the service is down for whatever reason, we're able to have that as well. And because I actually started where I did Turing coming from a Ruby mindset of like, I have information, and the result of a function that I call is that information. Async await makes a lot more sense to me. It also allows me to not have to worry too much about different callback structures as I start making more, as I handle more promises. So let's get into the specifics around query params, headers, and API keys. We're going to use the Unsplash API for this, and there's a few reasons for that. There are many photo APIs out there. This is the second part of our application. We've gotten the advice, and we're going to grab a photo. And this is free, and they actually encourage hot linking. And so there are other photo APIs out there that recommend, like, they don't want you using their servers all the time. And this one is like, no, we want that data of which photos are being called. And I'm like, great, that works for my purposes. So looking at their documentation, it's very comprehensive. It's really well organized. And rather than going through step by step, I've pulled out some pertinent information for us to look at. And some really important things, first of all, were essentially the root of the API that I'm using here, where it's available, and then a couple important headers we're going to look at. First of all is the version they recommend using it. It's not required to make the call, but it's helpful to follow documentation when they say to do so. Say they update their version and they have a newer one, you're still referencing that first V1. And then the authentication. In order to get Unsplash, I had to sign in as a user and get an access key. And then in order to make that request, this is an authorization header with client ID and then my access key put in here as well. So query parameters. These are important because we need to use them to search for the photos with the advice that we get back. And we'll use our question mark and equal sign to say, this is the query that I want with this particular information. So if my query is mountains, I get photos of mountains. If I want purple mountains, majesty, I can use the ampersand sign to actually call those photos of purple mountains. So, so we'll start with the GET request with that full URL, and we'll go through with the params of query advice, and we'll use these headers. So these are the basic components of this Unsplash API that we're going to be using. And it's going to look something like this. So I have in the URL area the endpoint that I'm grabbing, the Unsplash search photos. And there are no headers or parameters put in right now. And if I just send a request, I first get an error about authentication. I need that access token in order to make a request. And once I add in that access token and the requested version, I'm able to then send another request and get back the following error of like a query is missing. Oh no, that's because it's a query endpoint and they require that to actually search for something. And so I add back in that query. I'm using literal placeholder text for that, and it updates in the URL as well. And we get 83 results of placeholder images. And we have here several different URLs of a taped card. And when I look at it, it's a nice placeholder image, which is really great to have. So let's talk a little bit about API keys. And looking at this specifically is API keys are your authorization to get that information. As you saw in the Postman request, it would not actually send me the information I requested without that key. And generally speaking, you don't want it available to just anyone. You want your frog-loving doorman of the afterlife to like make that authorized handoff. That's the good place GIF in here. So let's talk more specifically about what that's like. So in a full stack setup, we have a client side and a server side, and the client-facing front end really can't send API keys securely in the browser without a developer being able to see it through DevTools. So you make a protected request to your server side, and it will use an environment variable that isn't exposing the full request to the browser. It's able to make that request, and then it sends back the response. Again, that's that diagram from the beginning of the talk, that response back to the front end. But Jamstack's like, you don't have to set up a whole server. You can do this without doing that. You can set up a Lambda function, which I believe Ryan will actually go more in depth on setting up functions in Jamstack. And so these functions are basically running server-side code, but you don't have to set up an entire server. But on the platform that you're using, you can store your API keys as environment variables, use them in that function without passing it through the browser. And it's arguably what makes Jamstack, well, Jamstack. And so for this authorized API request in the Jamstack style, you'll save your secret environment variable in your platform, take Netlify for instance, and create a function that makes that HTTP request. And then you'll access your variable using process.env of your secret key. And so the package used locally when you're testing out your code is .env. This package allows you to store environment variables and reference them using this package. And in order to declare and use it, make sure they're in your git ignore. You don't want to push up to your repo a file of all your API keys. I have actually gotten notifications before from GitHub and Google saying, hey, guess what? You got to get a new API key now. You push this up. And I was like, okay, yeah, let's ignore that. And then you just create a .env file. You declare it with a simple equal sign. And then again, you access it with process.env as the name of your environment variable. And so this is similar on like a lot of platforms in terms of like storing environment variables. And showing you on Postman, you might have noticed before I was using an Unsplash key. I wasn't revealing the actual API key that I had from Unsplash. And so it's really just a matter of setting up an environment, putting in your variable, and then the value in there. And then when you need to call it, this is a Postman example of being able to say, hey, this is the key that I've stored in my environment variable. In your actual like function code, it's using that process.env that your platform's able to interpret. So let's walk before we fly. Let's stick with the mechanics of the API call, and I'm going to let the function sides of things go over to Ryan. And so getting into this call, we've looking at how to actually like use environment variables in Vue, you can just know that they're not secret. They are being passed through your browser. And so you can create a .env variable. The .env package is within Vue already if you set it up through the Vue CLI. And you can access them by prepending Vue app to all of your environment variables and then accessing them in the same way, exactly, of process env, and then your environment variable that's going to get passed through your browser. So let's put it all together. We've talked about like actually making the call and then all the different components going through it. So let's build these all together into this dynamic app that we said we wanted to build. And so the first thing I'm going to do is add our get advice and our get photo button. And then we're going to take a look very similar to how we did with the information for our advice with our image URL, just to make sure that we get things up and running. And then the request that we have for our get photo function, it looks very similar to what we did before, but there are a few more things involved. So the first thing we have are our params in here in our Axios request. And it's structured just as like a JSON object, which is really great and easy to follow. And then we have our headers in here, and we're able to like show those headers in our request. And one thing I noticed when I was setting up this request is concatenating strings is a little tricky sometimes. You don't forget your spaces where you need them. And this is the response. Again, we have a large JSON blob that we're looking at, and we want to be able to look through it in a way that's not quite so eye-bleeding initially. And again, that's what I use Postman for a lot, is I can visualize the JSON. I can look at each key in that object to be able to traverse it a little more easily. And so I'm able to skip a few steps and look at response.data.results and look at the first results of here. And this is what we have, and things are looking a little bit better, but they're not quite there. And then we're looking at our URLs of this response, and we're getting closer. And if I look at the regular size, I want some big photos for this presentation, then I have an image URL. I can use this, which is exactly what we want. So using the image URL in our template, use a little bit of binding for the actual image URL. And then I'm going to add a toggle to show the image if the request is actually made successfully, so that I don't have just a broken image link on my page. I might have worked in the back end, but I know a little bit about showing things on the front end. And so we have here our adding into our function that toggle here, essentially this show image. We're going to set it to true when we actually get our successful request. And this is what it looks like. It's lovely. We have a placeholder image. This is fantastic after pressing that get photo button. So let's like daisy chain these things. Let's do what we set out to do of advice and getting the photo based on that advice. And so in our get advice method, our function here, we update our info, and then after that is done, we call our get photo method in order to update that photo based on the information that we have. And here is what it looks like. We get a photo with the placeholder advice, and then we go and get some custom advice. True happiness resides in the quest, for sure. And I have a happy photo. That makes sense to me. If you've nothing nice to say nothing in a vast expanse of nothingness in the photo. So those are our APIs and consuming JSON, just the very nitty gritty, getting in back to some like core components of web development and design. And so I'm excited to like get back to that basic. It's really fun, even like after using it for a while. So yeah, happy Jamstacking. Let me know what kind of questions y'all have about consuming APIs.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Alice, so much. Excellent. That's always really interesting to me to see these kinds of talks, because these are things that we all use every day. If you use Twitter, then you're using an API because their stuff is using an API. And it's really fun to go through all these details. You mentioned you came from like a very, very strong or strict backend, sort of course. And then you saw this, and this is sort of magical. What do you think is the right balance? Like, when would you reach for this versus like a strict Rails environment? I know we're talking about Jamstack, so we would never use Rails, but like in your experience, like when would you reach for this? What would be your choice?
I think it would be very incremental. Like if I am like building a Jamstack site and say I want to add like 1 or 2 extra features, I don't need to set up an entire backend server to say like grab some photos or maybe like grab a Twitter thread or something. Like that to me is something that can easily just be like portioned out into a function. You can do it on a one-off type of way, which is exactly what Jamstack is built for. If you're wanting to like track lots of data and do a lot more complicated things, in my opinion, of like you have a lot more logic and information going on in the back end, and you want to be able to like build that very customized for yourself, then like, yeah, setting up your own like Node or Rails server might make more sense in that way.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. That's a great point about the Jamstack of like you can add little things here and there. You don't have to set up a whole architecture. You can add like one little function.
Absolutely.
Zach, do we have any questions from the stream?
We do. We got one from Mick Jeets here. For those responses can get huge. GraphQL can mitigate this by making a more specific query. Do you think GraphQL APIs will replace REST APIs?
Replace is a strong word for almost any technology out there. I would say there is a time and a place for GraphQL queries and setting that up. I have to say I'm like not very strong in using GraphQL, so I can't really speak to actually like implementing it myself, but I do like recognize a lot of potential for that. For some of these more like simple one-off type of just adding a little bit more dynamic content, or maybe you're just using some sort of authentication for your site, like it might not make as much sense in that way. But I definitely am like excited to learn more about GraphQL as it's being used and the different situations that it's used in. But I would say replace is a pretty strong word.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Like depending on the scenario you're going for, it kind of makes sense to use one or the other. So
yeah.
We'll wait a couple minutes here. Oh, here we go. Ryan actually asked a question. Do you think there are still really good uses for monoliths, or is this idea of smaller services and RESTful endpoints the future?
Well, as somebody who's built lots of Rails monoliths over the past year, like monoliths are fun. Like you have so much control, and it's like you know exactly what's happening in both places. And Netlify is great for like deploying Jamstack applications and making those functions like really user friendly. For somebody who's like deploying Rails applications, Heroku makes more sense because it's just like connected straight to the database, and like your front and back end is kind of a little bit more separated, and so you're able to use a monolith structure a little bit more easily. So yeah, it's interesting. I think it depends on the tools and what you're comfortable in, really, in a lot of ways, and what you're building.
Definitely. I'm not seeing anything yet, so I'll give it another minute or so here.
What's you mentioned having used the IBM Watson API. That was really interesting to me. I would like to hear more about that. But kind of in conjunction with that, what are things that you've seen that are available? APIs that are available, things that you can build that have piqued your interest. What are things out there that you think people might need to know about, like the IBM Watson API, for example?
Well, let me talk a little bit about that, just because like I have used it before. So I set up an application that was doing sentiment analysis based on GitHub commit messages. So like trying to see how a developer was feeling at the time as they were making their commit message. And it was really fun to use that so we could like send a string of text to the IBM Watson API, and we get back a JSON response of the sentiment analysis with various scores. And so like, I didn't have to set up a natural language processor in order to like look at the sentiment of my GitHub commit messages. I could just get that back. And so that is like one way in which you can like use other people's like information and like functions in a really cool way. And in order to actually connect that, like I at first I had to like authenticate with OAuth through GitHub. And so that is an API call in and of itself. And so authentication, especially for Jamstack applications, like those are going to be API calls that you're going to use in order to access like specific information of a user's account on another platform. So, so yeah, like there's a lot more than just like getting advice and getting photos. Like you can dive much deeper into like the information that is out there.
Definitely. So we got a question from Dan here. How do you test APIs, especially external ones? Is it worth doing?
Oh yeah, testing APIs is definitely worth doing. Do not have specific knowledge of like testing Netlify functions. Ryan might know a little bit more about that. But in terms of setting up your tests, it's very like on a traditional server, you essentially create mocks or fixtures, like you create JSON objects that you're expecting and then make that call essentially in your test. So you're not specifically calling out to an external API. You're mocking that call in order to like get back and then test your function that way, is how I've largely tested APIs to make that happen. Thomas, do you have a little more like experience testing like Netlify functions and things like that?
A little. So of course, the function itself is again just an API to like more code. So that code is just kind of unit tested on its own. And then the function itself, I kind of treat that like a little bit of a black box, like what the function does, as long as it makes the call to its backend code, as long as it's taking its input from the network. That's what I'm testing, is just kind of the outside surface areas of it. Assuming that HTTP will work properly and Netlify will work properly and those sorts of things, just kind of assuming that those services work. I test the inputs and the outputs of the function. And services like Netlify, they give you a dev toolkit that you can run on your computer. So it spins up your functions as if they're running on Netlify's edge cloud. So you can run them and make sure they work. And then you can also run your tests that just run the function, because it literally is just a JavaScript function. So you can just import the JavaScript function and run it and make sure that it works. So you can kind of test it as if it was a unit, a unit test. You can just say import this function, test the input output, and then we're good. So
yeah, I was gonna say the way I've actually done it before at my current job is we have done, since a lot of our APIs are actually external, we had like the way we got around that was by doing unit tests of, okay, we're expecting this object back. If it works, and the response is good and clean, then that means we're good here. It's probably the best way you can test external APIs, we found at least.
I always try to caution against testing too deeply, especially a third-party API, because we don't test that JavaScript itself is working. We don't test the plus/minus operator, that kind of stuff. So assuming that the third-party API is correct, we just want to test that like the structure of the data we get back is right. Our application works correctly when it errors, when it sends back 500 or 404 or whatever. Our stuff works properly at the interface level, and we're not really testing much of like what's happening out there. That's for third-party stuff. Obviously, you can test your own. So
yeah. Okay, and we got a question from Bull Strauss. Is there a tool that you found to be more successful than others to mock, document, collaborate contract negotiations and version APIs at a team level?
I don't know that I can speak to that very well.
No.
Like documenting APIs that you're building.
That's a good question. Yeah.
I
I've
have
used Swagger before.
Yeah, I have two
Swagger.
Swagger, which I think they maybe renamed it, or it's been renamed from like the open API doc something. Anyway, yeah, I've used Swagger too. It's okay documentation. My experience with it has been like the sites that it generates, like the HTML sites that it generates of the documentation are super slow. I don't know why, because it should just be static. It should just be like, here's a bunch of HTML documents. I don't know why it's so slow, but that's been my experience. As far as negotiating the contracts of API versions, I've never had that work well. Like usually the backend is like, hey, we have a new version and you can keep using version 3, but now stuff is going to go into version 4, and it's up to me to, my team, whatever, to decide, okay, well, we're going to start upgrading to version 4. Here are the backwards incompatibilities and blah, 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 whatever. I've never dealt with the negotiation part of that. And I don't know that I've never heard of it either. So I think it seems like an unsolved problem almost.
Yeah. I think you're kind of right there, Thomas. Like, it's very difficult unless you're like keeping in someone's like checking the documentation daily or keeping like an eye on like their Twitter feed of whoever's building the API of, hey, we're upgrading like these endpoints or something.
Even internally, it's kind of like, if your teams are either perfectly locked together, so the front end and the back end are always moving in sync, in which case that is the negotiation, right? Like your teams are like, well, we're going to add this front end thing. Okay, we're going to add this back end thing. And that's the negotiation that happens. Or your teams are not doing that. And then in that case, like the back end team might be doing whatever they want. They just be like, well, we're going to deprecate this URL endpoint because we don't like how that's structured or whatever. And it's still going to work, but it's going to be deprecated in the next version. So we're going to go to version 4. And then it's just kind of like, there is no negotiation that happens there. Whether one's necessary, I don't really know, because like, yeah, as long as they're not deleting code and all of a sudden version 3 stops working, then it's kind of fine. As long as they're not just like, well, it's not going to work in a month. You better get going. Which that's just kind of dysfunctional management, right? Like the team manager should be like, well, we have to support our front end team, obviously. But I've never had a negotiation actually happen of like, here's how versions will work, and like, here's when we're upgrading, and here's how this will. It's never happened for me, and I hope that's the question that was being asked. But
yeah, it seems like they got what they were asking about. So, take one last call for questions. Otherwise, I think we're good here. Give it another second. Oh yeah, Dan also posted a blog post from Stripe about API versioning, so that could be a good resource about how they handle it. Yeah,
Stripe is a fairly well-loved API. So I think I've never really like learned much about Stripe, but that's definitely something that if you are interested in like, how is API development done well, probably look at Stripe and Stripe's documentation and all their stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm not seeing any more questions, so cool. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you so much, Alice.
Yeah. Fun to revisit like API consumption. It's really great.
I know I've been doing some crazy. So I've been messing around with Sanity, and they have a very interesting query language for their API. So I've been having to relearn a bunch of it.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
The way they like to do it.
Cool. Well, thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Alice.